Okay, so I think we will get started. Thank you everyone for attending this month's Teach Educational Rounds. Here with us is Dr. Laurie Zawertailo, who will be presenting on e-cigarettes for harm reduction. But before I hand it off to our presenter, I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping slides as per usual. So if you are interested in obtaining a letter of completion for this month's Teach Educational Rounds, please make sure that you have registered for this webinar and completed the pre-learning assessment. You have signed in to view this webinar using your first and last name so we can track your participation. And finally, make sure that you complete the evaluation and post-learning assessment that will be emailed to you, and you will have 1 week to complete that. These webinars are being live tweeted on Twitter, and you can follow us at @PSQuitSmoking or use the hashtag #TeachWebinar to post or read questions. Here's a biography of our faculty presenter who obtained her PhD in pharmacology at the University of Toronto in 2001. She did her postdoctoral fellowship in tobacco use in special populations at CAMH and has been a scientist at CAMH since 2005. Dr. Laurie Zawertailo research interests are in the areas of behavioral and neurobiological aspects of tobacco dependence and treatment, especially in individuals with comorbid depression and alcohol use disorders. She is also the co-principal investigator of the STOP program here at CAMH. Here are a list of her disclosures, as well as our disclosures. And the content of the Teach Educational Rounds is based on evidence-based guidelines from the following sources. These materials, as well as the verbal presentation and any disclosures and any discussions, set out only general principles, and they do not replace the need for individualized clinical treatment plans by healthcare professionals. And before I hand it off to our presenter, I'm just going to do a couple polling questions to gauge who has joined us here today. So in a minute, using your computer, could you please indicate which of the following organizations you work for? And if your organization isn't here, please type it in the chat box. So we have some family health teams, public health unit, addiction agencies, great. And again, using your computer, could you please indicate what your current discipline is? And you may need to scroll down to see all the options. So we have some registered nurses, non-for-profit in the side, health promoters, educators, addiction counselors, great. And finally, for the last poll, could you please indicate which region your organization serves? Central East area, Toronto and Greater area. I work out of province. If you could just please specify in the chat box, Alberta, great. BC, Halifax, awesome. Okay, so with that, I will leave it to our presenter. Thanks everyone, and enjoy. Great. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining me this lunchtime to talk about e-cigarettes. So I'm hoping that by the end of this presentation that I'll be able to describe what the current evidence base is regarding the safety and effectiveness of e-cigarettes as a replacement for tobacco smoking. We're also going to talk about the impact of fourth generation or pod mods and nicotine salts as a kind of developing and disruptive technology with respect to e-cigarettes and what that actually means not only for treatment potential effectiveness regarding replacing tobacco cigarettes, but the risk of addiction to e-cigarettes themselves, both in former tobacco users and in never users of tobacco. Sorry, I'm just getting acquainted here with the technology.
Okay, so in Canada we have a pretty robust regulatory framework for tobacco control that covers 4 pillars, and the top 2 pillars are what we're going to discuss today. So the target that Health Canada has dedicated itself to is to have less than 5% of smoking prevalence by 2035. And the way that that is going to be achieved is, of course, to help people quit smoking, because that absolutely needs to be done. We have a current prevalence of over 15% across the country, and to prevent people from starting smoking. And Health Canada recognizes that e-cigarettes can play a key role in both helping Canadians quit and protecting youth from taking up cigarettes. However, with respect to e-cigarettes, we need to balance the potentially huge public health benefit of smokers switching to a far less harmful form of nicotine delivery, which is vaping or e-cigarette use, with the potential risk of the uptake of e-cigarette use in adolescents and young adults that may actually potentially lead to future tobacco use or in and of itself nicotine dependence via vaping. So we are going to talk about what the current evidence is at, the evidence base regarding e-cigarettes as a method for helping smokers completely quit tobacco use or switch completely from tobacco use to vaping. What the current evidence is that that the adolescent or youth use of e-cigarettes is a gateway towards tobacco use, and what the current evidence is that never smokers, primarily youth, of course, are becoming, and I put in quotes, addicted to e-cigarettes, and we'll talk about addiction versus dependence to e-cigarettes. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the current evidence regarding harmful effects of e-cigarettes in the absence of smoking. I used the wrong down. Okay, so Health Canada has a newly revised Tobacco and Vaping Products Act, and this there's many regulations in there to help protect youth, preventing youth access and uptake to e-cigarettes. And the main one is that people need to be 18 or older to purchase an e-cigarette. There's a prohibition of sale and promotion of products that appeal to youth, including promotion across all media, including social media, that associates vaping with an exciting or celebrity lifestyle, that any promotion that depicts cartoon characters or animals that would appeal to youth, and testimonials and endorsements from celebrities and sports people, etc. There's also, similar to cigarettes, a prohibition of sponsorship of events, sporting events, and concerts, etc. And they are looking to restrict the promotion of products with candy or dessert flavors. Sorry, I will try to speak up. So additional measures that are in development at Health Canada are labeling regulations on all e-cigarette and e-juice products regarding the health and safety, and regulation of how the contents are listed and tested. And they also have draft permitted statements to put on labels of e-cigarettes and e-juice, comparing the health effects of e-cigarettes versus continued tobacco smoking. And they are also working on reporting regulations, including industry promotional activities, so how you can report that to Health Canada when you see something that is not right. So when we talk about e-cigarettes, we're not talking about a single product, as I'm sure you all recognize. So only over the past 10 or so years, e-cigarettes have evolved very, very quickly from a first generation or cig-alike product that was meant to mimic the look and feel of a traditional cigarette, but actually delivered very low doses of nicotine and not very effective nicotine delivery device. And then we moved on to second generation devices, which again look similar to a cigarette, but aren't really meant to look like a cigarette, and they are refillable devices, so you can choose your flavor and your dose of e-juice, and you can refill the product. And then this kind of evolved into third generation or mod devices, and these devices are they have a larger tank for e-cigarette liquid, and you can modify them with respect to the strength of the battery and how much the e-liquid is heated, and all of these different, and what sort of cloud or the volume of cloud that is produced. And these are very, they were appealing amongst a very kind of niche group of e-cigarette users. And now, of course, what are recognized as fourth generation devices are pod mods, and these include JUUL, which looks like a flash drive, and there are other flash drive-like devices that have pods that are either, you need to buy a pod each time, they're not refillable, or you can get devices that have refillable pods. These are known as open systems. So JUUL is not the only product on the market. There's Views, there's MyBlue, there's, and then a bunch of minor players in the market. But you hear most about JUUL, of course. So when it comes to comparing the effects of e-cigarettes versus smoking a tobacco cigarette, so e-cigarettes are delivering nicotine in a non-combustible form, thereby significantly reducing exposure to harmful carcinogens and combusted products from combusted tobacco. Nicotine itself is not classified as a carcinogen, and there have been many clinical trials looking at the risk of cardiovascular disease and other detrimental health effects associated with nicotine intake itself, not tobacco smoking, and meta-analyses have shown no increased risk of these diseases that are associated with nicotine intake itself, apart from smoking. So the tobacco control community is, they are on board with, or we all accept that e-cigarettes are less harmful than smoked tobacco. There's no longer any debate about this. And when you compare toxicants of conventional e-cigarettes versus e-cigarettes, you can see that e-cigarettes are not harmless. There are still toxicants in e-cigarette e-liquid, and when it's heated, some of these toxicants that are also in conventional e-cigarettes are also in e-cigarettes, and these include formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, acrylane, toluene, and nitrosamines like NNN and NNK. But you can see that the relative amounts of these toxicants are much lower in e-cigarettes compared to combusted cigarettes. So on the one side of the kind of Health Canada regulatory framework with respect to e-cigarettes is to help Canadians quit using tobacco. And of course, e-cigarettes is not the only strategy that Health Canada is promoting for helping Canadians quit using tobacco, but they do recognize that it may be helpful for some people. So we're going to just talk a little bit about what the evidence is regarding e-cigarettes in helping smokers quit. So, there's only been a few randomized controlled trials looking at the effects of e-cigarettes, usually compared to nicotine patch with respect to quitting. And the first one was published in Lancet in 2013. It used a first-generation e-cigarette, both with and without nicotine versus patch. And they showed no significant differences between patch and e-cigarettes at 6 months post-treatment with respect to abstinence. Their abstinence rates were quite low. They had a lower than expected quit in that program, so they weren't really powered to see an effect, a significant effect, but there was some slight differences. And then again in 2013, another study by Capinetto looking at e-cigarettes with different doses of a nicotine cartridge, this was done in Italy, saw a decrease in smoking behavior and approximately a 10% abstinence rate across the board, regardless of the dose of nicotine that was used. And this was in a large group of smokers who were not interested in quitting. So they were just basically looking at how e-cigarettes could replace tobacco cigarettes. And then more recently, a study published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which got a lot of press, randomized a large group of smokers in a workplace to either e-cigarettes, and these were cigarette-like devices, NJOYs, or NRT, or and/or incentives, so monetary incentives. And they had a very low 6-month abstinence rate that ranged from 0.1 to 2.9%. And the reason is because the way they did the study was you had to opt out of getting an email, and then if you didn't opt out, you got randomized to these groups. But out of the over 6,000 that were randomized to the different interventions, only just under 1,200 actually engaged in the program and did the next steps required to get either the free cessation aids, the free NRT, or the free e-cigarettes, or the rewards, the monetary rewards. And you can see here in this graph that when they included everyone, so people that were randomized but did not actually engage in any part of the treatment, you can see how low the quit rates are across the board. When you look at just the engaged cohort, you can see that people that were given the free e-cigarettes had about a 5% quit rate. Those that got just the NRT had about a 3% quit rate. Those who got monetary rewards or got money deposited into their bank account for quitting, plus free cessation aids, they both had the free NRT, had better quit rates. So this study was a little bit gamed because they didn't have a condition where free e-cigarettes were combined with the monetary incentives. So I think you would have, if you're comparing the rewards plus the NRT, then yes, you're going to have higher quit rates than e-cigarettes alone. So the study was, even though it got a lot of press, was highly criticized for its methodology. So the most recent randomized control trial was published again in the New England Journal of Medicine. And this was a study done in England, and they randomized people to a second-generation e-cigarette, so an e-cigarette where you can refill the e-liquid, or nicotine replacement therapy, and this included patch plus short-acting. So I just included this table here to show you that that the respiratory symptoms, comparing baseline respiratory symptoms to 1-year follow-up, you can see that in both the e-cigarette condition and the nicotine replacement condition, there's a significant decrease in the percent of people who report shortness of breath, wheezing, cough, and phlegm. So e-cigarettes seem to be as effective as nicotine replacement therapy at reducing these sorts of symptoms. So when they looked at 1 year abstinence and reduction in cigarettes, you can see that people who were randomized to the e-cigarette condition, 18.1% were abstinent at 1 year compared to about 10% in the nicotine replacement therapy group, so almost double. And in people who were not completely abstinent, you saw a more significant reduction in smoking compared to the NRT users. So when they looked at the different groups and asked what they were currently using, about 2.5% of people in the e-cigarette arm actually switched to using nicotine replacement therapy. But in the nicotine replacement therapy arm, almost or more than 20% actually switched to using an e-cigarette. So there was some confounding of the results. So when they removed these people from the sample, the 52-week abstinent rates in those who were assigned e-cigarettes and were using e-cigarettes versus those that were assigned NRT and were using NRT was 17.8% versus 8%. So again, a doubling of the quit. But also at 52 weeks, a lot of the e-cigarette, people that were assigned to the e-cigarette arm were still using e-cigarettes. So 56% of people in the e-cigarette arm were on nicotine e-cigarettes still at 52 weeks, and another 24% had switched to nicotine-free e-cigarettes, but were still using their e-cigarettes. And this is compared to only 9% of people in the NRT arm that were still using NRT. And in those using nicotine in their e-cigarette, they had reduced the strength of the e-liquid that they were using from 18 milligrams per mil, which is what was given to them at the trial start, to 12 milligrams per mil. And so, you know, from a risk reduction perspective, perhaps continued long-term e-cigarette use may be bad if it does pose health risks later on. And again, we don't know what the long-term health risks of e-cigarette use is, but it's also good if it prevents relapse to smoking. We know what the harmful effects of smoking are, and relapse, of course, is an issue with respect to every single treatment we have for smoking cessation. You know, there was some speculation that it may also help with cessation-induced weight gain if people continue to use an e-cigarette. So for those of you who are implementing STOP in your sites, you know that we ask about e-cigarette use at baseline. We also ask about e-cigarette use at our 6 and 12-month follow-up. And in 2016, we published a study in nicotine tobacco research where we looked at, we analyzed those people who said that they used an e-cigarette, and we looked to see what their quit outcomes were at 3 and 6 months compared to people who were not, who reported not using an e-cigarette during this time. And you can see that people who had used an e-cigarette in the past 3 months or in the past 6 months had a significantly lower odds of quitting compared to those who were not using an e-cigarette. Again, you can't publish in the e-cigarette field without being criticized by someone, and this study was highly criticized by people in the field because we only asked, you know, have you used an e-cigarette in the past 3 months or the past 6 months? We didn't ask about frequency of use, whether they were using it every day or only occasionally, whether maybe they only used it once, they tried a friend. We didn't ask about whether the e-cigarette contained nicotine. We didn't ask them why they were using an e-cigarette. So we changed our baseline and follow-up questions to include these measures. And so this is a recent analysis of our data. And on the left, you can see that at 6-month follow-up, so the green bars are the percent of people who have quit. The blue are the non-quitters. You can see in non-e-cig users at 6-month follow-up, we have a quit rate of about 35%. In people who report using an e-cigarette but using it only occasionally, so non-daily users actually have poor quit outcomes, which is what we showed previously. But in people who are daily e-cigarette users at 6 months, their quit outcomes are about the same as non-e-cigarette users. So it's not hindering quit, it's not necessarily helping, and again, these are stop participants, so they're also being given nicotine replacement therapy and behavioral counseling. However, when we look at 12-month quit outcomes, you can see that in the non-e-cigarette users, there's a little bit of relapse. The quit rate is a little bit lower. In non-daily e-cig users, there's very few people that have quit, less than 10%. So their rate of relapse is even greater. But in people who are reporting daily e-cig use, we actually see an increase in quit rate at 12 months. And of course, as a result, also very little relapse. So this is somewhat encouraging, and it speaks to perhaps an issue regarding, being unsuccessful on NRT, and does that mean that maybe people should be, if they're interested, be supported in using an e-cigarette to continue their quit or to try and quit. Maybe they've reduced with nicotine replacement therapy, but they haven't fully quit, and so e-cigarettes will push them towards being completely abstinent. So, of course, on the other side of this kind of double-edged sword or a two-sided coin regarding e-cigarettes is the issue of protecting youth and non-tobacco users from nicotine addiction. So we're going to kind of switch from cessation to use in youth and young adults and uptake among non-smokers of e-cigarettes. So this is the National Youth Tobacco Survey in the U.S. This is 2018 data, and you can see that among U.S. high school students, e-cigarettes are by far the most popular tobacco product amongst both boys and girls. You can see cigarettes are quite low, pipes very low, hookah, smokeless tobacco, but amongst high school students, there's a lot of experimentation. So this is just, I believe it's past year use of any tobacco product. So you can see that the experimentation of tobacco products is still relatively high among high school students. A quarter to a third of high school students will experiment with all of these different tobacco products, but the one they seem to be experimenting the most with is e-cigarettes. And you can see over time that this experimentation with e-cigarettes has really kind of, there's been this spike of e-cigarette use among high school students in the U.S. in 2018. There's a little bit of uptake of any combustible, but these are all, the rest of them are pretty much all declining over the years and continue to decline in 2018. It's e-cigarettes that are seem to have this uptick, which has caused the FDA to kind of characterize this as an epidemic, and they want to try and curb the use of e-cigarettes amongst youth. But when you actually look at the frequency of e-cigarette use among youth, And again, this is sort of 2014 data from the same survey, not 2018. But you can see that in both middle school and high school students, the vast, vast majority use it only, 1 to 5 days in the past 30 days. So this is, very occasional, experimental. Someone has it at a party or something, and they're just, they use it, but they're certainly not habitual users. And when you look over at the other end of the spectrum, you do have a certain percentage of high school students and middle school students that are using it every day or almost every day. But again, this is the minority by far. So what about in Canada? So in 2017, among Canadians, all Canadians age 15 or older, about 15% of us have tried an e-cigarette, and 3% of us have used one in the past 30 days, and only 1% report daily use. However, when you restrict it to just younger age groups, you can see that it's actually almost 30% of young adults aged 20 to 24, and 25% of those aged 25 to 34 report trying an e-cigarette, and about 23% of high school students or youth aged 15 to 19 reported ever trying an e-cigarette. And then of those, about 6% had used in the past 30 days. But daily use was, again, very, very rare. E-cigarette use seems to be more prevalent among males than females, and males were more likely to use in the past 30 days than females. So, but again, JUUL came to Canada in August of 2018, and so we may see an increase in use among youth and young adults because of this new technology. I'm sure everyone's heard about JUUL. It's very appealing to youth because it doesn't look anything like a cigarette. It comes in some appealing flavors. It's very discreet and easy to hide. It doesn't produce a whole lot of exhaled vapor, so you can use it kind of surreptitiously in places where you probably shouldn't be, in the back of your classroom or et cetera. And so, this sort of thing is quite appealing to young people. But of course, there's more than just JUUL available on the market. So there are vapes, there are other kind of minor products, ghost pods, and as I mentioned before, you can there are these closed pod systems, of which JUUL is one, and this simply means that you need to buy these replacement cartridges to put into your device. So there's no way, and it can get quite expensive. Whereas these open pod systems, the pod is actually refillable. So you buy your nicotine salt e-liquid of choice, and you refill the pods. So these can be really quite inexpensive, and of course, in price-sensitive use, they are also quite appealing. So these devices, these pod mods, use something called nicotine salts versus a nicotine-based e-liquid. And basically the difference is the nicotine, rather than getting the e-liquid in a regular e-cigarette use, regular e-cigarette contains either propylene glycol or vegetable glycerin or a combination of the two as the kind of where the liquid that the nicotine is kind of suspended in. and this is what is heated and vaporized. With respect to nicotine salts, the nicotine is actually combined with an organic acid, usually benzoic acid, but there's also devices that use lactic acid. And this produces a nicotine salt, which is at a different pH, and this allows there to be a higher concentration of nicotine in the vapor, and it doesn't cause the throat irritation and upper airway irritation that a higher dose of a traditional, higher dose of nicotine in a traditional e-liquid would cause. And so you can see that, higher nicotine, smoother vape. And it also produces this nicotine vapor at a lower temperature, so you don't get the high heating that may increase the level of toxicants. And because you can get so much more nicotine with each puff, you get a more immediate nicotine rush. And this is, but in people that like to produce a big cloud of vapor, et cetera, JUUL and other nicotine salt devices don't produce that much vapor. So this is just survey data from the Centers for Disease Control again, and you can see, this big uptick from 2017 to 2018 in the use of e-cigarettes among high school and middle school students, and this completely corresponds with the sales figures of e-cigarettes over the same time period. So you see this big uptick in total e-cigarette sales, and it's mostly due to this huge uptick of sales of JUUL. But what about the harmful effects of JUUL? So this is information taken off the JUUL website, so take it with a grain of salt. This is not published findings. But when they look at change in biomarkers, so plasma levels of biomarkers of exposure to tobacco use, and the change from baseline to after 5 days of either abstinence in the gray or JUUL use in the green or continued cigarette use in the brown, you can see that JUUL use decreases these biomarkers of exposure by the same amount as complete abstinence from smoking does over a 5-day period, whereas continued e-cigarette use, you see a slight increase. Again, this is taken from the website. I have no other information. I don't know which biomarkers they measured. I just thought it was interesting that that this is the way they kind of promote it. And I have no reason not to believe that you would have significant decrease in biomarkers of exposure compared to continued smoking. I would just like to know which biomarkers they measured. So again, looking at the effectiveness of JUUL for smoking cessation, this was a study published in Harm Reduction Journal that looked at kind of point of purchase of JUUL, and then asked these people who purchased the JUUL, asked them 3 months later whether or not they were abstinent. So the full intent to treat sample is in the black, and then what they call the efficacy sample, or the people who actually responded to their 3-month survey, is in the gray. So you can see in the intent to treat sample, about 30% of people who purchased an e-cigarette, a JUUL, reported being abstinent from smoking 3 months later. It didn't matter whether they purchased it from a retail store or the website. Again, this is a study published by the makers of JUUL, so you may or may not want to believe it. There have been no independent studies yet of JUUL for smoking cessation published. So with respect to how nicotine salts deliver nicotine and whether they are any better than a standard e-cigarette, this was a recently published study in Internal and Emergency Medicine, and they look, this is not JUUL, this is the MyBlue nicotine salt device. And so I know this is a little bit hard to read, but this is a pharmacokinetics study, meaning that they took plasma blood samples at baseline, at time 0, and then every minute for the first 10 minutes after using the device or a cigarette for 5 minutes, and then out to 30 minutes post-use. So the large increase here, that's when these smokers smoked their usual cigarettes. So you can see a kind of classic pharmacokinetic curve for plasma levels of nicotine, where you get a peak at about 7 minutes, and then a slow decline over the 30-minute time point. This next line is the highest dose of blue nicotine salt. I believe it's 48 milligrams per mil. JUUL, the high dose of JUUL is 59, I believe. And you can see that the kinetics profile is similar, but it doesn't quite reach the peak nicotine, plasma nicotine levels as a combusted cigarette does, and the time to the peak that it does reach is a little bit slower. And then with each kind of decreasing dose of this MyBlue nicotine salt device, you see decreases in plasma nicotine levels that are reached. And this bottom one is actually just a regular kind of nicotine-based device. So this study was done in smokers that were not e-cig users. So there could have been some kind of learning curve with respect to how to use the device to extract the right amount of nicotine from it. So there are some limitations to this study. But they also asked about subjective effects, which were interesting. So compared to their conventional cigarettes that relieved their craving, had the right amount of nicotine, et cetera, these other devices scored much lower on kind of satisfaction, relief of craving, et cetera. So when you look at the pharmacokinetics of JUUL, again, the yellow curve is the plasma levels reached when smoking a traditional cigarette. The pink line is the commercial version of JUUL, so the 59, I think it's 59 milligram JUUL, and this is the lower dose JUUL, and this is a traditional e-cigarette. So you can see that the traditional e-cigarette does not deliver nicotine in a very effective manner, but the commercial JUUL product does, and it's very, very close, both with respect to peak concentration reached and the time course. And so this is, this, as with respect to smoking cessation, is actually quite encouraging, right? Most smokers complain either that their nicotine replacement therapy or other e-cigarettes do not produce, do not give them the satisfaction, do not give them the level of nicotine that they require either to alleviate withdrawal or to fully replace their smoking. And I think, this sort of data suggests that JUUL will be an effective replacement for smokers with respect to nicotine delivery. However, this sort of pharmacokinetic profile is of concern from an abuse liability perspective. So, when people that are not smokers but are using JUUL, this sort of fast onset, high peak, reaches brain quickly, occupies receptors, followed by a pretty fast offset, thereby kind of engendering the need for another dose, is of potential concern. So, we can talk about whether this is an issue, whether this will simply kind of Yes, it will engender continued use and dependence on a nicotine salt product, but will it actually lead to tobacco use? Maybe not, because tobacco use won't give you any more of a hit of nicotine than JUUL. So this is completely up for debate. So that's pretty much it. I hope that I've satisfied all of the learning objectives that I set out. And I think I just wanted to leave you with this, because I know many of you are clinicians, and you're probably wondering, what this has to do with who you see on a daily basis and what you can tell your tobacco smoking patients about e-cigarettes. So, I think certainly more and more evidence is coming out that they are potentially an effective replacement for tobacco smoking and an effective cessation aid. However, there is currently no e-cigarette with an actual medical or therapeutic indication, either as a device or as a medicine. So, unlike nicotine replacement therapy, which has a therapeutic indication for smoking cessation, or varenicline or bupropion, e-cigarettes do not have that. E-cigarette manufacturers can apply for that, but no one has to date. So, but what are the ethical implications of that? So, of course, we still don't know what the long-term harms are, and we're not going to know. So in the absence of knowledge regarding potential long-term harms, can you recommend these products? Some people are concerned with the involvement of big tobacco. Philip Morris or Altria bought a 35% stake in JUUL, and other tobacco companies have other e-cigarettes that they are currently developing or marketing. With respect to, but what about, so someone's come to you, they've tried everything else, they want to try an e-cigarette, and they want your advice. So, are there ethical concerns with not supporting someone who has tried everything else and just really needs support regarding their choice to use an e-cigarette? There may be organizational concerns. Does your organization have a position on e-cigarettes that you need to kind of conform to? And then there's a systemic issue. I mean, certainly in the U.S., they're falling all over themselves with this concern of youth uptake of e-cigarettes that may or may not lead to, as a gateway to tobacco smoking, and that we would undo all of the public health benefits that we've seen over the years that have significantly reduced the uptake of combusted tobacco among high school students, youth, and young adults. But we have to put this in the context of the continued tobacco pandemic. We need to help people quit smoking. And if we can get them to quit smoking by switching to an e-cigarette, then that is a win. That's a public health win, in my opinion. And of course, harm reduction needs to be an option, especially for people who cannot completely do without nicotine in their lives. And these, of course, include people that are of social disadvantage, health disparities, mental health addictions, etc. So I'll leave it there. We've got 10 or 12 minutes for questions. Thank you. Okay, lots of questions. So I'm not sure how to... do I support the Public Health England statement on e-cigs being 95% less harmful? I don't think they did themselves any favor by putting a number on it. We don't know how much less harmful they are. We know that they are less harmful. So I'm going to abstain from answering that question. I don't know if 95% is the right number or not. So 52-week abstainers on slide 23, if that was the Hayek title, a study from the New England Journal of Medicine that was just published, then yes, they are still using e-cigs. Many of them, 56%, I believe. So a question regarding the uptake of youth e-cig use in Canada as mostly experimental and largely inconsequential. I would say in most youth that is the case. I think we need to pay attention though to the people, the young people that are using it daily or almost daily. I don't know if you've heard of the class action suit in the U.S. 15, I think she was 15 or 15 when she started. A girl in Florida who has become dependent on JUUL after starting, not realizing that her mango-flavored pods contain nicotine. And, you know, it is a class action suit. I don't know how many other people have signed up to be part of it, but I think that'll be really interesting, you know, if the lawyers and the lawyers at JUUL can prove or disprove that these things are addictive in a clinical sense. So, you know, can you apply DSM criteria to e-cigarettes or JUUL use? It'll be interesting to see. I'll be following that. Are JUUL pods able to be recycled? Interesting. My 18-year-old son just pointed out when we were walking home from the TFC game the other day. He's like, you don't see cigarette butts on the ground anymore. You see pods. You see JUUL pods. And I'm like, okay, we'll point one out the next time you see it. I haven't noticed, but I guess if you're a high school student whose friends, and probably him too, are JUULing, then you notice these things. So recycled, I don't think so. I think they're like Nespresso pods or something. You know, perhaps they're recyclable, but not in the city's recycling program. With the salts, is the risk of popcorn lung? So I don't know what the flavorants are that are used in nicotine salt e-liquid. One thing I didn't mention is that, you know, that they don't have the propylene glycol or the vegetable glycerin, and so, you know, those two components can be of concern. When heated to high temperatures, they produce the things like formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, et cetera. So removing those from what you're inhaling, probably a good thing. So the popcorn lung is because of the flavorant, the diacetyl flavorant that is in or used to be in a lot of e-liquids that were kind of very sweet, kind of cookie dough, buttery, anything buttery flavoring. There's been, to my knowledge, not a single case of popcorn lung resulting from e-cigarette use. You know, you need a huge exposure to this diacetyl compound in order for that to be an issue. And I think most e-liquid manufacturers now have removed that as a component in their e-liquids. Yeah, there isn't any research on the long-term health effects of e-cigs. And again, you know, it will be always confounded by the fact that the vast majority of people who are using e-cigarettes were former smokers. So, you know, it's going to be really hard to disentangle the effects of a history of smoking with a current e-cig user. So, yeah. There's some questions here. Okay. E-cigs ought to be regulated and perhaps used as a prescription for those who feel they cannot quit. Sure, Gary, but that means that the makers of an e-cig need to apply for either to Health Canada for a therapeutic indication, and it's an expensive process that requires clinical trials, large-scale clinical trials, not only looking at the safety but the effectiveness. They have to show probably that it's more effective than what is the current gold standard for smoking cessation, so more effective than nicotine replacement therapy or prescription medications. And, you know, they don't have the deep pockets of big pharma. for the most part, yeah, unless it's big tobacco that's going to go for a medical indication, and they're probably not going to do that. So it would be nice, but I don't think it's going to happen. Comparison chart that compares the differences between the 4 generations of e-cigs. So Rachel, if you mean with respect to the pharmacokinetics and nicotine levels that are reached, there probably is the chart somewhere, and I can tell you that that certainly the cig-likes have had very low plasma nicotine levels that were able to be reached. The second generation, quite a bit better depending on the dose of nicotine that was in the e-liquid. The third generation, I'm not completely sure about, but again, it's the nicotine salts that seem to be able to really boost the plasma levels of nicotine that are reached. Data on secondhand exposure. So good question. So most of the data has been, people doing experiments looking at the ambient air in an enclosed space where there's a lot of vaping going on. So like a vapors conference or something, and so really dense e-cig vapor. And what they've mostly noticed, as far as my understanding of it, is that because the vapor droplets are actually quite heavy, and so what happens is that the nicotine and other constituents don't actually stay in the air; they kind of fall onto surfaces. And so, when they do swabs of the furniture, the carpet, or whatever, yes, there is nicotine and other constituents there from the e-cig vapor, but actually breathing in secondhand vapor, I don't think there's been any indication that sort of secondhand exposure happens. And it's not going to be the same as tobacco smoking anyway, right? Because it's usually kind of the side stream smoke. It's not the exhaled smoke that people are exposed to secondhand. So Eve Arsenault wants to know what the STOP program's official stance on e-cigs and their use as a smoking cessation aid is. We don't have an official stance. As I said, I think you need to, you need, as we've always encouraged with our STOP practitioners, you need to meet the smoker kind of where they are. And if they're interested in using an e-cigarette as an added aid to their cessation attempt, then they shouldn't be discouraged. What they should be encouraged to do is to use it daily, and not to just kind of use it intermittently or in places where they're not allowed to smoke, that sort of thing. But to really, if they're really interested in using an e-cigarette to replace their cigarettes, that they need to use it daily, and they need to work at completely replacing their cigarettes with the e-cigarette. Yeah, I think that's, I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question. A client told me to say he got COPD from using an e-cigarette for 1 month. Is this possible? I'm not going to say it's impossible, but I've never heard of it. I mean, you can't get COPD from smoking a cigarette for 1 month, so I'm not sure how that would happen with an e-cigarette. Yeah, sorry, I'm not a clinician. I should have said that from the very beginning. I'm a researcher. Oh, what do you suggest as a support for youth who wish to quit using e-cigarettes? So again, I think that this is going to happen, that people will become, if not addicted in the traditional sense, dependent on an e-cigarette, and they're going to need some guidance on how to quit. So there's, there are different things that you can try. You can try tapering the dose of nicotine. You can try nicotine replacement therapy as again, a safe replacement for the nicotine. but I think most of it is behavioral, right? So if they're motivated to quit, then they need to change their behavior, and you need to give them the same advice that you would give a smoker, right? Stay away from your friends who are using e-cigarettes. Get them to engage them in supporting them, not hindering their attempt at quitting e-cigarettes, and start to recognize the kind of what the triggers are, how to deal with and address sudden cravings or urges to use the e-cigarette, etc. I hope that was helpful. Again, I'm not a clinician. Should we only be recommending JUUL over other e-cigarettes? Yeah, I wouldn't. I think that people need to find what works for them. And again, JUUL is, it's the name brand that everyone knows about, but it's not the only one on the market, and it is the most expensive one. So there are other ones that are less expensive, that have the refillable open pod systems that are much, much, much less expensive. Nicotine salt may be something to recommend, but again, some people find that it's too much. Even smokers find that it's too much of a nicotine hit. So people need to it's a bit of trial and error, unfortunately. Go to the vape store for advice, absolutely. Yep. Our position at our clinic is that NRT is recommended at first. E-cig's not discouraged if they've tried and failed using NRT. That's great. Yeah. If we advise them to use them daily, what do you tell them on which device to use and which strength of each use? Again, it's completely individual, and people need to kind of do a little bit of trial and error. Thankfully, the e-liquids themselves are relatively inexpensive, and even the devices, you can get a decent quality second generation e-cig device for $35. Okay, I'm getting lots of thank yous, and it's 1:02, so I'm going to sign off. Thank you, everybody. Great questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zawertailo. That was a very educational and informative webinar, and thank you to everyone who participated. The chat box was very engaging. I know we didn't get a chance to answer all of the questions, so if you do need additional support, please email teach@camh.ca, and we would be happy to provide you with a response or direct you to Dr. Zawertailo. And this is a reminder that you will have 1 week to complete your post-learning assessment if you would like to receive a letter of completion. And if you participated as a group, please make sure you email teach@camh.ca with a list of participants by 2 p.m. We will not be looking at the chat box to see who all attended, so please do email us if you attended as a group. And our next educational rounds is Optimizing Smoking Cessation Treatment in 2019, Part 2, presented by Dr. Selby, and that will be on June 19th. And registration will be opening soon, so you can look forward to that. And again, if you have missed today's presentation, you would like to view it again, or you are interested in seeing previous TEACH webinars, a link of our archived webinars is found on our site, and we will be emailing the slides this afternoon as well. Thank you, everyone, and have a great week.